You are most welcome wherever you are coming from. It's great to have a full house listening to a friend and a man who helped us launch this centre a year and a half ago with one of his sizzling talks about Pope Francis. Sizzling because it's hot off the press. Austen, and that's true. That's true.
Said that.
But on behalf of the team here at the Jesuit Centre, so that's myself, Father Jerry Clark, the director, Pierce Jackson, Tom Layden, Karen Collins, Sean O'Brien, and Jerome Marley, we'd like to welcome you and welcome our keynote speaker, Austen. I'd just like to say that during his research in Argentina into the Argentinian church and to Pope Francis, the man who later became Pope Francis, Austen came across two texts of retreats given by Bergoglio, as he was known there then, and discovered in the process that actually the later Pope Francis was a retreat director and spiritual director much in demand, and that these notes were a valuable testimony to his spirit in accompanying and in teaching the ways of God. Then he gave a retreat, Austen gave a retreat based on some of these notes and on the teaching of Pope Francis and the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius to the Jesuits of the British province. And there was, I think, one Irish Jesuit present at that. I think it was an online retreat during the lockdown, and that was our former provincial Leonard Maloney. And it was at a later event here, it might have been at the launch or at a later event, that Leonard suggested to Austen that he put those retreat notes into a book. And that's how we have, thanks to our provincial, we have this book, First Belong to God, on Retreat with Pope Francis. And that's the book that we're launching here today in Belfast. But we're launching something else as well, which is emerging out of this book. We're making an invitation to anybody and everybody, people of all faiths and none, to experience the depths of Ignatian prayer as practiced by Pope Francis and reflected in his teaching and in his pastoral approach, to make a retreat over 8 months, beginning in September. And there'll be a sign-up sheet for anybody who would like to express their interest in that at the end of the afternoon. We're planning to, Austen will begin talking in a few minutes, and then we'll have a break around about after 45 minutes. And then the idea would be just to get into small groups and see how we react to what Austen is saying. And then we'd have a general conversation and then finish sometime just on or before 5 o'clock. So I hand over to you, Austen, and you're most welcome.
Thank you so much, Jerry. It's great to be with you today again, because I was here in November 22 for the launch of the centre, and it's looking great, and it's great to be back with you. So there is a connection between this place and the book, which Jerry has mentioned, and I'll come back to. What I thought I'd do with you in these 45 minutes is reflect initially on the connection, or try to understand the pontificate, the journey of the pontificate of Francis from 2013 till now, in terms of the periodization of the exercises, so week 1, week 2, week 3, and week 4. Some of you may not be very familiar with the exercises, and I'll give a little sketch of each week as I do this. So this has really occurred to me, not least because I was preparing to talk in Dublin yesterday at Gardiner Street. And I remember that the last time I was there was for the launch of the first biography, which is called The Great Reformer. And that came out in 2015. And what a different time that was. I remember the whole atmosphere around the pontificate was one of expectation. He could really do no wrong. He was walking on water. He was on the cover of, GQ magazine and how quickly that then later changed. And looking back, you can almost see the pattern of the exercises in it. So I'm going to lay that out for you just as a way of introducing the theme. And then present the book to you, tell you what the book is and what it's trying to do. And then I want to suggest some ways in which spiritual direction is a key for understanding the way Francis has exercised his papal ministry. So what I'm going to suggest is and I don't think this is controversial, every pope brings something different to the papacy in the way they exercise the papal ministry. And not just the qualities of their own lives and their countries and so on, but also something of a different way of being a pope. And that what is unique and distinctive about this pope is that he has brought this charism of spiritual direction, which was very much evident in his life as a Jesuit. As Jerry was saying, key to this book, key to First Belong to God, and key to my understanding of Francis all along have been these, actually there were 3, not 2, volumes of his retreat talks that he gave over 20 years as a Jesuit, provincial, as a formator. And when I discovered them in 2013 while researching the biography, I remember I didn't really start to read them till I got home and worked on the book, and I realized they were a complete goldmine. They were an insight into the Bergoglio's mind and thinking, and it really helped me to understand him as Pope. So it's a real treat, actually, to be able to bring those talks into this book and almost have Francis direct us on a retreat with them. That's the idea of it. Not least because they've never been published in English. I don't understand why, because they are, as I say, a wonderful text, but they've never been translated or published into English. Good, so I'll conclude there with this idea of Francis as a spiritual director leading us, the church, on a journey of conversion. Good, so let's just think about the pontificate, just to set the scene. So Bergoglio is elected, as you know, in March 2013. And almost immediately, he's striking the themes of the first week of the exercises. The first week of the exercises is really about 2 things: the proclamation of God's mercy and the knowledge that we are created beings, created out of love. And then a call for us to realize and recognize how far we have betrayed that origin of who we are. So the principle and foundation with which the exercises begins is followed by this proclamation, if you like, of God's mercy and a recognition of our sin. So Francis is elected and immediately strikes this embodies in almost everything he does and is the mercy of God, the welcome, the unconditional love and embrace of God, and a call to reform. I mean, my book was called The Great Reformer, and all the talk back then was of the reform. And the 2 first great teaching documents were about our relationship with God and our relationship with the created world. Evangelii Gaudium 2013, Laudato Si in 2015, were really a summons for us to restore and recover our relationship with our Creator and our partnership with creation, the great theme of Laudato Si. And as I say, remembering just what it was like back then, there was this enormous respect and admiration for him across the world. And I don't mean in the church necessarily, although there was still at that time, but I mean outside the church. I remember he was the toast, if you like, of the liberal media. He was seen as somebody who was going to bring in all these changes. And of course, a lot of people projected onto him their own idea of what change and reform should be. There were people who were very wary of him, certain groups, conservative groups, one might say, who were very wary of him, even at that stage. But they kind of kept quiet. They were wary. They were waiting to see what would happen. There was this enormous sense of expectation. But when I published The Great Reformer, which in a way captured that, I went to America. It was an American book, American publisher. And I was interviewed by everybody, all the conservative radios and TVs, EWTN. I was even on the Raymond Arroyo show, which would never have me on now. They were all fascinated by Francis, and they all wanted to try to understand him. So people were fascinated by his freedom, by his tenderness, but I think there was this respect for his authority as well. And as I say, my biography captured that. It was a time in which he could do no wrong. And I must say the biography was very successful. It was widely reviewed, and that was the moment. So think about the first week of the exercise, but think about also the beginning of Jesus' ministry. That's kind of what happens. The crowds come. Jesus is seen as a person of great authority who heals and who has this amazing summon of God's mercy and God's grace. So if that first week, I would say, is kind of 2013 to 2016, 2013, 2014, 2015 really would be the key years for that. And then things start to change in 2016, which I would start to think of, so 2016 to 2018 as being the second week of the exercises. Yeah, I might just need to fix it. The second week of the exercises. Now, if you've done the exercises, you know this is the week where we're called to follow Christ, to put Christ at the center of our lives, and to, as it were, operate with the values of the kingdom. And this, of course, involves choices. It involves doing things Christ's way rather than what is always convenient to us or what we think. And I think in 2016, you can see at the conclusion of the Family Synod in 2015 and the Amoris Laetitia, which comes out in 2016, which is, as you remember, the big controversy of that synod was the accompaniment of the divorced and remarried. And Amoris Laetitia very much endorses where the synod ended up, which is the need for the pastoral accompaniment of individuals in those situations and the need for discernment of each situation. But I can remember how the atmosphere turned very sour that year, particularly from groups in the United States who were concerned above all with what I might call family values and the resistance of liberal modernity. And they saw Amoris Laetitia as kind of giving into this. You started to see not just the libertarians who had objected to Laudato Si, they didn't want the church getting into ecology. We now had all, if you like, a certain kind of family values groups beginning to turn on Francis. And things get uglier as it goes on. I remember it was a very dark time. So just bearing in mind the second week of the exercises, making choices for the kingdom, the two standards, it's a time for choosing. Putting Christ at the center meant confronting in the church very directly various ideologies, clericalism, legalism, moralism, but also, on the other hand, a progressive agenda that wanted certain changes in certain directions and were very disappointed when Francis didn't do the things that were expected of him. So he starts, if you like, to lose friends on both sides. So a disillusionment, a disappointment, the sense of disappointment. We had expected this of Francis, and this isn't happening. But what most strikes me, thinking back on that period, is the mounting opposition to Francis, which begins to express itself. We have the dubia of the cardinals, the growth of the ferocity of the radical traditionalist movement linked to national populism, and Francis insisting in a very Christ-like way on the Beatitudes and on Matthew 25, that Christ is to be known and discovered in the poor, in the stranger, above all, in the migrant. This very, very, very strong gospel emphasis on his, contrasting, if you like, with the outlook of so many others in the church. And then, of course, we get the clerical sex abuse crisis breaking out in 2018, which you in Ireland lived through very much, of course, with the visit of Francis to Dublin that year. You remember all the various scandals, the McCarrick scandal, all these countries like Australia and Germany producing reports into historic sex abuse. It was almost never off the front page, and everybody's saying, what's the Pope doing, and the mistakes that were made with Chile and so on. So really, it was a very, very dark and grim time. And that was the time that I was putting together my second book on the pontificate, which was called Wounded Shepherd, which came out at the end of 2019. Again, thinking about the Gospels, isn't this what happens too? Jesus initially walks on water, can do no wrong, is seen as a person of great authority who attracts the crowds. And actually, as the Gospels go on, particularly in Mark and John, you can see the opposition growing, the Pharisees beginning to look out for Jesus, looking for ways to catch him out. And so When I went back to the United States at the end of 2019 with this new book called Wounded Shepherd, suddenly nobody wanted to interview me. Certainly not all the EWTN media. In fact, there was very little interest in the book. I ended up giving lots of lectures, but they were mostly East Coast kind of Jesuit universities. I wasn't invited anymore onto all those radio shows which they have in the United States. My publisher said very honestly to me, "We think Francis's star has fallen. The liberal media is no longer interested in him. They're disappointed. He hasn't turned out to be what they wanted him to be." And by the way, Wounded Shepherd, which some of you may have read, I think it's a pretty good book, but it was a failure. It didn't succeed in terms of sales, and translations didn't really happen, not least because coronavirus happened the next year. But as a book, even in the title, Wounded Shepherd, you can see there's a new grimness there. And the cover is black. I'm not sure I should have agreed to that, but it's a black cover. Francis looks a bit grim. And the title, Wounded Shepherd, was actually all about me understanding that Francis was inviting the church to a deeper conversion through the embrace of its wounds. So to understand in the wounds of the abuse crisis and other wounds of clericalism and so on, the church was called to a profound change by embracing and understanding those wounds. So that was the atmosphere in which Wounded Shepherd came out. Now, as I say, I have to be careful with these periodizations, but I would say roughly this goes to about 2019. So end of 2019, the book comes out. And then in 2020, you may remember something happened. And in fact, 2019, it was already looking pretty grim in the world. There was the breakdown of the world order, the rise of national populism, and then suddenly we have coronavirus. It's a very, very somber time, which I don't need to remind you about. The ecological crisis is deepening, and suddenly we have this extraordinary epidemic, which is causing us all to stay inside and is causing suffering, death, and economic paralysis on a huge scale. Where is God in all of this? So I think this is what corresponds to the third week of the spiritual exercises, which is all about the passion of Christ. And the big theme that Ignatius brings out in the third week is that divinity goes into hiding. You can't see God. It looks like God isn't there. And isn't that what was happening during that period? It's a time of tremendous darkness and desolation. And when Francis stands in the square of St. Peter's on the night of March the 27th, in what would be, by the way, the most watched event in human history. The Vatican tells me this, they don't announce these things. It's amazing how many people saw that extraordinary message that night. Francis, of course, starts, doesn't he, by saying, the world is covered in darkness. There is a darkness over our squares and our empty streets. He himself made this address from an empty, desolate, rainy St. Peter's Square. But what was he doing at that moment? He was guiding us through the third week. And the theme of his address was that Jesus is with us in our shipwreck. We may not think he's with us, or in the case of Mark chapter 4, the disciples think Jesus is asleep, right? Which is the same thing, right? He's asleep. Where is he? What's he doing? But nonetheless, Francis wanted to assure us God was with us, Christ was with us. And this was a time of purification, of conversion. God was at work, as it were, and reassuring us of that. And the main task in this time was to hold firm. Ignatius's advice in desolation, stay true, hold firm, allow the process to happen. So, of course, 2020, at the end of 2020, we have the release of Fratelli Tutti, the call, the third of the great encyclicals, the call to fraternity. Now, this was the context of my book with Pope Francis called Let Us Dream. So I wrote to Francis that year, that Easter of 2020, and proposed this little book, which I spoke about when I was last here, that would be, in a sense, spiritual direction for a world in lockdown and in desolation. And he agreed, and that became Let Us Dream. So I was working on it that summer, and at the same time in 2020, Damien Howard, the British Provincial of the Jesuits, asked me to give a retreat for the British Jesuits, but Leonard Maloney was also on it, and their collaborators on the big themes of the pontificate. So I prepared this retreat. It got me thinking a lot about the links, of course, between the exercises and the pontificate. And I gave that retreat online, and afterwards, Damien and others said, you should publish this. You should think about publishing these as talks. But I hesitated. I didn't want to, because Let Us Dream was then out at the end of that year. And Let Us Dream in many ways became a kind of a retreat book in 2021. Many people used it in discussions in parishes, and it was a real privilege on Zoom to give talks and help that, particularly during that time of lockdown. It was very grim. It was wonderful to help people, as it were, navigate that crisis in hope, using Francis's spiritual direction in Let Us Dream. So that's why I didn't do anything really about the retreat book. It seemed that Let Us Dream was already doing that. Now, from 2022, and here's where it's going to get difficult because it's now, I think we're living through the fourth week of the exercises in the pontificate. The fourth week, of course, is the time of the resurrection. When we meet the risen Christ in Galilee, and we know Christ, as it were, again, we know Christ is different. We have to relearn who Christ is and go out on mission in response to Christ's mandate to go out on mission to the whole world. The fourth week of the exercises in the pontificate, Francis is much older. He's much more frail. He aged considerably as a result of coronavirus. He's had some spells in hospital. His health has been sometimes fragile. This year had bronchitis a lot, and it's taken longer to shake it off. And yet, I don't know about you, but I'm very struck by how different this period of the pontificate is from the turbulence, particularly of 2017, 2018, 2019. That turbulence, the opposition is still there, but the opposition seems to have sort of melted away. Some of his most strongest opponents who have tried various things have one by one been exposed and either died or gone silent. And there's this sense in which, even though he is weaker, perhaps more vulnerable, there's a power now, an authority in the pontificate, which I think is quite kind of remarkable. One might say this is a pontificate living out of grace to a large extent. And various reforms, processes of reforms which were initiated earlier in the pontificate, have come to fruition, not least the curial reform. But above all, this is a time of the pontificate which is very, very missionary. I don't mean that he's going on trips, although of course he is. He's just announced, by the way, the longest trip, what will be the longest trip of his papacy, in September, 11 days to Asia. I mean, a lot of people are going, what? But then he did this last year when he went to Mongolia for a few days. Again, this is a man of 87, but who has that missionary drive still. I suppose I mean much more in the language that he's using, the language of todos, 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 everybody. The church is for everybody. The church needs to learn to become a place which mediates the universal love of God and everybody welcome. And above all, to give expression to this in synodality, the journey of the Synod on Synodality, which concludes, as you know, this October, which is preparing the church for the future, for a new future which will look very different from the past. So putting in place the processes which allow the reforms of the pontificate to bear fruit in ways that prepare the church for the future. It's also a time, I think, of consolidation, in which a lot of the changes and the teachings are being consolidated and finding expression. And Francis, in a very calm way, is also talking a lot about his death. He's talked about he's going to be buried in Santa Maria Maggiore, where the slaves used to be buried. He's even said he's found himself a tomb. At the moment, it's a broom cupboard being used for candelabras. He said, that's where I want to be buried. And he's talking in a very, very straightforward, one might say very practical Jesuit way about the arrangements for the future. So all of this is the context, the fourth week we are now living out of, the conclusion of the pontificate. I hope it's a conclusion that's going to last for a considerable time longer. But this is the context in which I'm bringing out this book. And as Jerry said, the reason for the book is that when I met Leonard here at the launch of the Belfast Jesuit Centre, he said to me, "Why haven't you published the book?" Because I had promised to do so. And I gave various excuses. And he said, no, come on, you've got to do it, and I'll introduce you to messenger publications and so on. So he put salt on my tail. And that's what I was working on last year. And what occurred to me was that I couldn't simply do the talks of that retreat. That retreat was very much bound up with coronavirus and that particular moment. I wanted to open up much more the theme of the book to the whole pontificate, to thinking about the whole pontificate and the spiritual grammar of the conversion to which Francis has been calling us. So having presented this, as I say, this idea of the pontificate in the 4 weeks of the exercises, let me just briefly talk about the book. So it's called First Belong to God on Retreat with Pope Francis. So the idea is, even though I've written it, that Francis kind of is the spiritual director. I did ask his permission, by the way. I said, "Father, is it okay if I put on retreat with Pope Francis?" And he said, "Yeah, it's a great idea. What does the Pope think?" So I said, "Well, I hope he likes the idea." He did. But he also very much liked the theme of belonging, which is where the title is taken from Gaudete et Exsultate, the document on holiness of 2018. And the book begins with a quote from it, which is to say, in a sense, which is the big theme of the book, which is that our belonging in so many ways depends on our embrace or acceptance of God's gift, the gift of life itself, and learning to live out of that gift. The quote is this: "Only on the basis of God's gift, freely accepted and humbly received, can we cooperate by our own efforts in our progressive transformation. We must first belong to God, offering ourselves to Him who was there first, and entrusting to Him our abilities, our efforts, our struggle against evil, and our creativity, so that His free gift may grow and develop within us." One might say that is the task, my friends, of the whole of life, is to embrace the truth of the giftedness of our creation. But to understand that our difficulty in accepting that, or the myth of our own self-creation, that we think that we are responsible for creating our own lives, the myth of self-creation, lies behind so many of the crises that beset not just our own lives, but our world. Our relationship with creation and our relationship with each other has been deeply damaged by this distortion of who we are. So the theme of the triple belonging, which is there in Laudato Si', that our belonging is firstly to God, but also to creation and to our fellow creatures. And in the second two cases, we are partners with other created beings, is key. So that is really a big theme of the book. And the way it's laid out is, because it is a retreat, rather than chapter 1, chapter 2, it's day 1, day 2, day 3. And we move, as is traditional in the exercises, through the contemplations. So day 1, day 2, and day 3 are week 1. Well, day 1 is the principle and foundation. Day 2 and day 3 is week 1. Day 4, day 5, and 6 are week 2. And then we have day 7, which is week 3, and day 8, which is the fourth week. So we move through the traditional contemplations of the exercises. And the idea is that each day we have 4 reflections from me, but they are basically Francis. I just channel Francis. I take his pontificate, the teachings of the pontificate, those talks he gave as a Jesuit, and I give some suggestions, some pointers, some ideas to invite you into a reflection. And then, if you could imagine them, if you were on retreat, they would be 4, 10, 15-minute reflections, something like that. I don't know whether any of you been on a preached retreat, as they're sometimes called. I've been on a number, particularly in the Spanish-speaking world, and it's quite a common model in the Ignatian retreat centers. A group will go on retreat, and you'll have somebody who gives the points, as they're called, each day, And then you will probably have your spiritual director who you will meet up with individually. But you all meet to listen to the points. You have your reflections, and then you have the prayer and the exercises that you do on your own. At the end of each day, there are the spiritual exercises, and they aren't just the spiritual exercises of Ignatius. I also have a second lot of exercises, which I call contemplate, discern, propose. This is the method that Francis deploys in Let Us Dream for our own discernment. So we begin by contemplating reality, and we don't turn away from the pain and the suffering of our world. And we start to ask, where is God operating here? Where is the Spirit of God at work? Where is it calling us to a conversion and change? And conversely, where is the bad spirit, which has no independent existence but seeks to frustrate the good spirit? Where is the bad spirit seeking to distract us from following that good spirit or tempting us down a different way? And then propose is on the basis of the clarity of that discernment, what do we now need to do or suggest or propose in terms of a way forward? This was the method that Francis uses in Let Us Dream for navigating the crisis of coronavirus, which I'm applying here to the various crises of our world. Okay. So the idea of the second lot of exercises is that they're really to be done kind of together. Obviously, you can do them individually, but I think it's very powerful if you come together and you share the fruits of that second group of exercises and prayers. And you can start to see collectively where God might be calling us. So that's how each day is constructed. And at the back, because it does get a little bit complex, I've put a kind of map of the whole retreat. And you'll see day 1, day 2, the theme each day of that day, the names of the 4 contemplations, or 4 reflections that I'm giving each day, which of the spiritual exercises of Ignatius I'm dealing with that day, and then a series of texts, which are a lot of texts of Francis's, where I'm inviting you to go off and read a slab of Evangelii Gaudium, or a chapter of Laudato Si, or a part of Fratelli Tutti. I'm inviting you to read those sections. It might be a chapter, it might be a few paragraphs to help with your reflection. Now, there is a fair bit of reading, I have to say, and various people have said to me, if you tried to do this in 8 days, it would be a bit content heavy, you'd be busy. And of course, the purpose of any retreat, the real action happens not in the reading of the text, but what happens in your own contemplation and prayer. So what I say at the end, because I have a section called How to Use This Book, or How to Use This Retreat, I suggest that one of the ways it could be very fruitfully used by a group or by a parish or a community is over 8 weeks, where you might individually, that gives you time to do the reading, the prayer, and then you come together at the end of the week to share the fruits of that. But of course, what Jerry is proposing, which I think is amazing, is the idea of doing this over 8 months. So that's fantastic. So that's just a few tips about the book, and as I say, it's there at the back. And when you see it all laid out, it'll begin to make sense. So let me now just suggest a few pointers to the Pope as a spiritual director. This is the third part of what I wanted to share with you, and this is some suggestions about how he has led the church in this distinctive way as a spiritual director. There's a theologian called Jill Golding, who has written a book called Pope Francis and Mercy. And she said something quite startling in there, which I completely agree with, which is that Francis is the first pope, she says in hundreds of years, one might say ever, to be able to allow a very high degree of disagreement and tension within his leadership of the church, confident that differences can be made generative and fruitful. So this is in itself, from the very beginning, a discerning kind of leadership, one might say, which, by the way, requires on his part quite a lot of freedom. And one of the characteristics of Francis as Pope has been his freedom. From the very beginning, people were commenting on it. People In the Vatican, I remember one cardinal shaking his head and saying, he is so free, amazed. But also, Francis clearly, in the way he's exercised his pontificate, often bypassed the curia, often sought to free himself from agendas which he feels are being imposed on him. Interestingly, he said recently in a book in which he's reflecting on Benedict, it's called El Sucesor in Spanish, he says that the curia failed to respect Benedict's freedom. And of course, Benedict's secretary, Ganswein, Francis uses various anecdotes in the book to make clear that Benedict was always constrained by these powerful gatekeeper mediators. And the one thing that Francis does right from the beginning is destroy the mediators, the gatekeepers. He goes to live in the Santa Marta, where he has direct access to everybody, and everybody has direct access to him. And you might say, well, that's just him. He likes to be free, but I think it's more than that. I think actually he needs that freedom to be able to exercise the pontificate in a discerning way. So I want to suggest that he's really creating spaces. His task as Pope has been to create spaces and processes which allow for the Spirit, as it were, to work in us and in the church. And much like a spiritual director accompanies a retreatant. On a retreat, how does the change happen? The spiritual director doesn't change you as a retreatant. You have a fantastic spiritual director and he has a big, but it's not, the agent of change is the Spirit. And Ignatius says right at the beginning of the exercises, it is normal for God to communicate directly with his creatures. And in a way, the spiritual director mustn't get in the way of that. And I think this is what Francis is doing in his own role. To some extent, he's allowing for that interaction to take place. Early on in the pontificate, after I'd published The Great Reformer, I was talking to Antonio Spadaro, the Italian Jesuit, who for many years until recently was director of La Civiltà Cattolica. And Spadaro, you remember, did the famous first interview with Francis in 2013. Anyway, Antonio said to me, I asked the Pope directly, I said to him, Father, do you think you are a great reformer? Using the title of my book. And Francis apparently said no. He said, I don't think I'm a reformer. I think what I'm doing is putting Christ at the center of the church, and from there the reforms will flow. Now that is exactly what happens in the second week of the exercises. When we are invited to make Christ the center of our lives, then the changes, the reforms, the reorganization of our life flows from that. And that's the first thing really that got me to think about this way of Francis leading. Francis himself notes that reform of our lives is not just putting right what is deformed, but also conforming to what is new, to the lifestyle, criteria, and choices of the Lord. It's, in other words, a new mindset, a new horizon. And reform is always carried out to enable mission. We are reformed in order to enable us to go out in mission to the world. So day one of First Belong to God corresponds very much to the principle and foundation, to restore us to why we exist and what we exist for. And day two and day three, in the titles, there's a big clue to what's going on. Day two is called To Come Out of Ourselves, and day three is called The Lord of the World. So both of those days are about week one. And the call to come out of ourselves is, for me, I've discovered a really important key to how Francis thinks and what he's trying to do. In Spanish, the expression is salir de sí, or in Italian, uscire di se stesso. In English, I'm not sure to come out of ourselves really sounds a bit weird, but the idea is self-transcendence, where we are able to transcend our own mindsets, our own psychological boundaries, our attachments and so on, in order to receive the gift that God wants to give us. Right from the beginning, Bergoglio, as cardinal, when he addressed the cardinals before the conclave, used this expression, that the Spirit calls the church out of itself to go out to the peripheries to evangelize. It's the Spirit that leads the church out of itself. And he contrasted that with the church that is, as he called it, autoreferencial, closed in on itself. like the paralyzed woman in Luke's gospel who, as it were, is bent down and cannot see beyond. She can only look at this restricted area down there. Now, this very short speech he gave, and he, by the way, then says that the task of the next pope is to lead the church out of itself. It's very clear there, right from the beginning, what the mandate of the pontificate is. What a lot of people don't know is that 6 years earlier in Aparecida, in the big meeting of the Latin American bishops, where Cardinal Bergoglio emerged as the kind of key figure, he gave a homily in which he said almost precisely the same thing. It was much longer. It was a kind of hymn to the Holy Spirit. But he uses the same image there of a church turned in on itself, and again used the image of the woman bent over. But he then added something that I don't think he said later, which is, and the people of God somewhere off over there. So the church turned in on itself, withdrawn into itself, closed to the Spirit, and withdrawn from the people. It's a very powerful image, a diagnosis of why the church in the Western world has so often failed to evangelize, because it's in desolation, or rather it has given in to desolation. It has allowed itself to turn in on itself. So this is the way, the big theme of the book. In the foreword, which Pope Francis kindly wrote to the book, he describes right in the very beginning, in the first paragraph, that the drama of our lives, the battle that defines our lives, is a struggle, he says, to overcome the temptation of closing in on ourselves so that the love of the Father can make its home in us. We are tempted to live life as if it were not a gift of our Creator, to live in the illusion that we are sovereign and self-sufficient, so that all the crises that beset us, wars, injustices, sorry, this is me, not him, the ecological crisis, have their roots in this rejection of our belonging. So the drama of our own lives, the drama of our world, but also the drama of our church, is to be able to come out of itself, to receive the leadership, if that's the right word, the guidance, the inspiration, literally, of the Spirit. And that when the church fails to do that, it starts to live, as it were, for itself, as if it were the purpose of, as if the church existed for itself. And that's where you start to get all the problems of the church seeking to protect its own reputation, seeking to be successful, and organizing itself, as it were, in a worldly way. And that's what the second day is about, the temptation of worldliness. I think the boldest move I make in the book is to dedicate a whole day to this theme of worldliness, but it's absolutely fundamental to the pontificate. From the very beginning, Francis said it, and he's returned to it so often, that the biggest temptation now besetting the church is what he calls spiritual worldliness, which is, as it were, the use of the gospel and religion, not for the sake of the gospel, but for the purposes of our, or the church's own success or status or honor and so on. So the drama of our time, the call of the Pope to the church to evangelize, is a call for the church to transcend itself, to come out of itself, to receive the gift of the Spirit so that it can once again go out on mission to the church. So the dynamic that, as it were, Francis is seeking the church to embrace is what in the retreat I'm asking you or the retreatant to embrace, because it's the same thing. It's the same spiritual basic drama. And this matters, I think, a very great deal, because why has the church gone into desolation, or so often in desolation? And it is, by the way, something I've become very aware of since becoming involved in the synod from the very beginning and talking about it, is so often we find the church in a state of deep disappointment. Things were much better before. Why aren't our children, why do young people no longer come to church? Shrinking congregations, it feels like decline. But really what we're invited to see by Francis is that this is not decline, but transformation. We are undergoing a profound period of change. In Aparecida, the Pope talked about el cambio de época, the change of era. We are going through a change which is similar, one might say, to when the church went from Palestine to the Roman Empire, or went from the Byzantine era to the medieval era, or from the medieval era into the Renaissance era, and so on. In each case, there is a profound shift, and the church looks very different afterwards from the beginning. And what is the problem? As with any crisis in our own life, the problem is that faced with the threat of loss and change, rather than the attitude of faith, which is to ask, how must we change in response to the invitation of the Spirit? Rather than that, we double down, we go into ourselves, we try to cling to what we're losing, we try to recover what we've lost. And that's what causes us to go in on ourselves. In Wounded Shepherd, I describe this option as the option to discern and reform rather than to lament and condemn. Now, lament and condemn, I don't need to explain. It's the people who have no longer come to church, who have lost their faith, secular society, secularization and consumerism, and you spend all your time basically blaming modernity and everything out there. You, of course, you assume everything's right with you and the church. The problem is all out there. That's lament and condemn. What's missing in the lament and condemn is you're not involving the Spirit. You're not opening yourself out to the new thing the Spirit's trying to do for you. Discern and reform is that. It's to say, what is the Spirit asking of us, and how must we change in order to be able to go out on mission to the reality of the world as it is now? So I've said from the very beginning, I've said this before, this is the task of the pontificate, is to invite us into this process of discerning and reforming. In a book which I think brilliantly articulates this, and I did a long article about it in March, and an interview with the author. The author is Tomáš Halík. I don't know, some of you may have heard the Czech priest, few of you are nodding, the Czech priest philosopher. He has a book called The Afternoon of Christianity, and he brilliantly articulates this transition, using Jung's metaphor of the morning of our lives as being, you know, the youth of our lives is like the morning, and then we have the midday crisis, and then we go into the afternoon. So for the church, if you like, the morning of Christianity was the first 1,000 years. We are emerging now from the long midday of modernity, beginning with the Reformation through to ending with secularization. And we're now on the cusp of what he calls the afternoon of Christianity. He says in my interview with him that John Paul II and Benedict, in his view, are the popes who bring to a close the church's long engagement with modernity. And Pope Francis is the first pope of the new era in which the church is seeking to find a new home in the what one might call the postmodern era. Now, Halík, by the way, doesn't know Francis that well, and the book doesn't talk that much about the pontificate. He loves Francis, but John Paul II was the one he knew best. So, but it is a very, very profound diagnosis, and I want to suggest, and I've said to Jerry already, if you're going to do this 8-month retreat, please have Halík's Afternoon of Christianity with you, because I think it's the best articulation of the conversion or the call to self-transcendence which is required of the church to navigate this new era. So I don't want to go on too long, but I want to give just briefly three instances of where I think Francis has acted at particular moments as a real spiritual director. One of them is over the sex abuse crisis, where I think he's understood that the big problem, the challenge of the sex abuse crisis, is that it's so easy to miss the discernment, the discern and reform invitation, because we're so concerned with solving the crisis that we miss the deeper thing that the Spirit is calling us to. And it's very clear in the sex abuse crisis that the whole focus on justice, which the media very much has, justice for the victims, punishing the abusers, sacking the bishops who have covered up, new legislation, all of which, by the way, I'm not against and is necessary. But can you see that the exclusive focus on that is problematic? Because actually it excludes the possibility that there is something deeper going on in this crisis. So I think what Francis has done is created space for that discernment. And it's very clear in 2018, when he's writing letters to the people of God, he's saying there is something happening here. We need to understand that to move on from the sex abuse crisis, we need to become a different church. The source of the problem is a mentality. It's clericalism. It's a structure, it's a mentality, it's a way of thinking. It's a set of privileges, it's putting the institution at the center rather than Christ, and so on and so on. So that the answer to the crisis, yes, of course we need to do lots of things in the short term, but long term, it is a conversion in the very internal culture of the church, which of course synodality is designed to help us produce. That's just one example. And by the way, in Wounded Shepherd, I spent a whole chapter describing how Francis navigated literally day by day through that crisis, responded to the attack by Vigano, trying to get us to focus on that deeper conversion. The second example is the one that I've already mentioned because in relation to Let Us Dream, which was over coronavirus, when Francis stands up in the square. And what he's doing throughout that period, throughout those months, is he's inviting us to see that the whole world, that the crisis that besets the world, isn't fundamentally the crisis of coronavirus. The crisis is a crisis of fraternity or lack of belonging. It is because we have become individualistic, because we have focused in on ourselves, that coronavirus has been so devastating. And it is the priorities by which we have organized our societies, economies bent, for example, on growth, choices about spending and so on. That's why the crisis was felt so acutely. So to invite us to understand that through coronavirus, God is not leaving us alone. There is a grace on offer to us, which if we can receive that grace, will allow us to emerge stronger afterwards. He quotes right at the beginning the poet Hölderlin, who says, "There where the danger is, there grows the saving power." It is precisely in the threat, in the danger, in the crisis that we find the way out, marked out for us by grace. And then finally, synodality, which is the topic, by the way, of day 6 of the retreat, which is about fraternity and synodality, which is really the same idea. I've been very involved with the synod from the very beginning as one of the people who does the syntheses, the reports. National level, I did it also at a global level in Frascati, and I was with the Synod Assembly last October in Rome. And from the very beginning, people have tended to see the synod in 2 ways. One of them is to focus on what I might call the celebrity issues, the idea that there are disagreements in the church which the synod somehow is going to resolve one way or the other. So the media, what's going to be decided about women's diaconate or this question or that question. I think from the very beginning, that's been a very superficial way of seeing the synod. And really the much deeper and more realistic way of understanding it is what Francis has continually been said, which is to say that the most important thing about this synod is synodality itself. That's to say, in together, looking at these topics which might divide us or we might agree about, we learn the practices, habits, and mindsets of this new way of being, which we call synodality. But I think there's a third way of understanding the synod, which is as a mechanism of ecclesial discernment. And I think we're seeing this more and more clearly. In other words, we consult the people. The people listen deeply to each other. We hear what the Spirit is saying to the church through these assemblies. It then passes through the various stages: discussion, dialogue, discernment, reports. And then we have the assemblies in Rome. And what happened recently, and then we have a report. So at the end of last October, we had a report, as it were, capturing the state of the discussion on all those questions. And then what did the Pope do? Just last month, he announced that he would create 10 study groups or commissions, whatever you want to call them, who would take further these 10 different topics and report to him, the Pope, next June after the conclusion of the Synod. So you see what he's doing. He's saying these are topics which really need work and discernment. The Synod is incapable of doing that, not in a 3-week assembly. So we take those issues out, we get them really well worked and well studied, and then the Pope ultimately decides. So thrown up by the Synod, worked on by groups, the Pope then decides. Meanwhile, the Synod assembly itself focuses on synodality itself. So here we're seeing the creation, I want to suggest, of a new model in the church, a process, a mechanism, whatever you want to call it, in which allows for conversation in the Spirit. Allows for topics to be discussed using the conversation in the Spirit method, which unmasks the spirits involved and helps the authority of the church, the bishops and finally the Pope, make discernments based on those discernments. So again, it's very much the spiritual director's role. Okay, let's put all this out. Let's put it together. Let's see what's arising. Where is the Spirit speaking? Where is the bad spirit acting? And then how do we proceed? I could give many examples, but I don't have time, of how the Synod is already changing the way decisions are made in the church. I think Fiducia Supplicans, which came out at the end of last year, is a brilliant demonstration of the way the Synod has asked the church to hold in better tension, truth and mercy, to hold them together better rather than to see them as antithetical. And that was a specific request of the Synod, which, by the way, your new Bishop, Alan McGuckian, brilliantly captured in his statement on fiducia. Anyway, I don't want to go into all that, but just to say, I think we've got a new dynamic appearing in the church. We're already seeing the profile of it emerge. And to me, it's very exciting because it is what is allowing the church to navigate the path into this different future, this afternoon to which we're called. And that is the journey of conversion, which ultimately asks of us that we become missionary, that we go out in mission. So it's all about preparing us for that mission, which is what the purpose of the book is. The purpose of the book is to prepare us to be missionary disciples in this new era. And it's just a delight for me to be able to bottle the pontificate in this way and to say to people, there is a journey that the Pope is calling us on. This pontificate has been about calling us to that journey, and here's one way of doing it. Thanks very much.
Austen, we'll let you take a rest. You've given us all your energy and your thought and your learning and your experience. Now's the moment for us just to buzz and to share a bit about what we've heard. There's so much that Austen has said. Maybe one or two or three thoughts are salient and important for each of us. So I'm going to propose that we divide into informal groups of between 4 and 5. It's also perhaps an opportunity to go to the loo, which you'll find through the back door there and upstairs, or grab another cup of coffee or tea. So we'll give another 15, 20 minutes to forming small groups informally. Grab somebody beside you, somebody in front of you, somebody behind you, and form a group of about 5 or 6. Is that okay? Great. Thank you, Austen. So I invite you now to bring your conversation to a close as we start the plenary session. Austen is going to reply to some of the points that you raise, and just logistically, could I invite you to wait for the microphone to come to you? Oddly enough, human voice can't be heard in this big room unless it's amplified. So as we begin to come back to the large room, there'll be a roving microphone. I think Declan will be roving with the microphone. And just to ask you to be patient until it arrives to you. So if you remember, I was asking if each group could nominate one person just to share something succinctly of what was happening in your group. Austen was telling me just during the break that one of the skills of synodality that they're discovering is succinctness. And it's one of the challenges as well. So without putting too much pressure on individuals and requesting now quietness required to hear each other, could I call on one of the two groups here? I think Suzanne is going to nod her head and say just a word in response. What went on in your group? Give us a moment on that.
Gosh, I hope I can do it justice, because there was a lot of, we started off just talking about how hope and reform was key, and an energy for that was the initial overall. And then it went into people being puzzled just by, I'm not going to do this justice, just puzzled in the church of before and the church of today and the coming forward. Maybe, involvement people living in the parish or living in the society, not knowing what's going on. So that communication and awareness. And that was, there's probably a lot more, but
Thank you, Suzanne. Very succinct. The group behind Suzanne?
I'm very, because my parish priest is here, and his homilies are available online instantly. We had the great good fortune to have somebody in our group who's new to Catholicism, and talked about what attracted them to the church, and it really was Francis and the work of Francis, and going back to the basic gospel beliefs. I couldn't summarize the rest of the conversation because we were all over the place, but I would like to take the opportunity to say one word about synod, which struck me as being really, really important. There have, of course, been synods throughout the history of the church, but the suggestion of the synods at present is that there's a great listening exercise, trying to draw on the experience of many different members of the church, rather than having an echo chamber of the canonical and theological experts right at the top.
Thank you indeed. And then maybe going to the group at the back here.
Yes, so Austen, thanks very much. That was a really amazing talk. I'm sure everyone agrees, but there was two things we kind of spoke about, just two things you said. Pardon me if I'm sort of quoting you wrong here, but belonging comes from learning to live out the gift of life itself. We kind of thought that was very profound, particularly myself. I work as a psychologist, and it's a very complex sentence, that, I think, learning to embrace your own sort of faults and sort of failings, and that of, I guess, life itself, and where is God in that midst, as well as in one another. And that obviously requires the healing gift of listening itself. So, and the second thing was to hold in better tension truth and mercy. I thought basically Paul was up at the front, St. Paul, giving a talk there, to be honest. But I kind of thought that was really profound, and I would actually love if you kind of potentially shared more on that, I guess, so at some point, if possible, if we have time. So to hold in better tension truth and mercy instead of this sort of antithetical approach. And that obviously comes from kind of understanding each other, the differences that we have, but also not to criticize. That was my sort of take on that, so that was something we kind of spoke about.
And the group behind you?
I represent a group of two, and we've instantly, I don't know Marion at all, but we instantly gelled about certain things which were common to us, which really I won't disclose, they don't. But I would just like to say the spirit of our conversation just reminded me of the synthesis report which was published recently on the Synod on Synodality, which closed in its first session closed in October last year. And I just was reminded about the way we gelled, Marion, and the language we used was reminiscent of the synthesis report. I mean, it is a wonderful document, and I would be very critical of documents coming out of the Vatican, but it is so readable. It is not like your usual report from the Vatican, which is long-winded, no full stops, a bit of Latin thrown in. This is a wonderful, I know I'm plugging it, rather than your book, Austen, if you'll forgive me, but it is just, in contrast, I mean, it has language like reciprocal relationship. Now, not so long ago, you wouldn't have heard a pope using that phrase. And I mean, we, Marion, instantly engage in a reciprocal relationship of listening, talking, listening. And secondly, I mean, it talks about the people of God rather than the hierarchy. I don't even know if the word hierarchy appears in the 40 pages, but it's the people of God, it certainly does. I could go on, but it would be unfair to you, Austen, who gave a very good lecture, and we'd like to thank you.
Thank you. And then this group.
Is this on? Can you hear? I just want to say, Austen, I actually have read your book. I recommend it to everybody. I'm a follower of yours. I've read The Wounded Shepherd. I've read them all. I love your clarity, your writing. You make the word of God accessible from the words that are coming from Pope Francis. But he's Pope of mercy. He's the Pope of all. And it's in our woundedness, that's where we meet him. And this is very strong. First belong to God. That's where we start. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then just this group up front here, please.
Just to prove that I might be infected with synodality, I'll keep this very succinct. One of the main points we made was we stop thinking of decline and think of transformation, And a second point, it's a change of culture. Our culture, we weigh one another up by correcting one another, seeing faults. Listening to the Spirit, conversation with us in the Spirit is something very, very different.
Thank you. I think there was one group at the back. Yeah.
Some of our group have gone. We very much appreciated your input, Austen, and some of us already have the book and have enjoyed the content. We had a question as to how to handle so much wonderful material in conjunction with the retreat, because as Ignatius didn't give the manual of the spiritual exercises to the retreatant, and his emphasis was on prayer and transformation and personal encounter, we wondered if someone might do the spiritual exercises and then read your book to do their 5th week, to live it out, and wondered if that could be an approach.
No. This group just here in the front. There's one behind you.
Thank you, Austen. We sort of took we're trying to get the idea of how do we break it down into a succinct, I'm already breaking the rules here. I think we see that Francis is the synology and the idea of for everyone, mercy for everyone. And also, we mentioned that this was a great opportunity to learn a little bit about Ignatian spirituality. Not all of us have done any retreats. I think we're very lucky to have Ignatian spirituality, to have Jesuits and their spirituality. We could make a lot more use of that throughout the whole church. And we're very lucky now, of course, we've got Bishop Allen here and down in Connor, so hopefully that will spread as time goes. So that's what I think. Did I cover it? Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Thank you. And there's one group to the back, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Ivereigh. We had a great discussion in our group here, and we spoke about a lot of issues. Our conclusion as a group was that we must be reformed in order to go out on mission. Thank you.
Is that it? Yeah. Well, lovely. Well, thank you very much for those reflections. And I don't want to try and respond to all of them, but just to pick up on a couple of things. First of all, what you said about the Synod report will make my colleagues very happy, because if you knew the circumstances under which that report was written, involves staying up all night against an impossible deadline with all these amendments flooding in that we had to incorporate. The fact that the document is readable and accessible is a great tribute to them. That Synod report, of course, what it tries to do, as I said, is capture the state of the conversation. So it's not resolving anything, it's saying, here's where we are. And that's what we've been doing, in a way, learning to do in the Synod, is to say, here is the state of the conversation or the discernment, and to learn to live in tension, to learn to live, if you like, in disagreement. And one of the great revelations of the assembly was that that's okay, because we're walking together, confident that none of us completely possess the truth, but we are opening ourselves out to the truth which is beyond us, which we're learning to receive. And that kind of humility, that mindset of humility, is really key to the conversion of the church, the culture of the church, that humility, which is very much what Day 6 in the book is about. One of you picked up on the truth-mercy polarity. You were very struck by that. And in the Synod report, there's quite a lot on it. And I think it was one of the most fruitful discussions in the Synod assembly. And just to explain it a bit more, Jesus holds together truth and mercy perfectly. That's to say, his truth always heals, but he never lies in order to bring mercy. He doesn't downplay the truth. He calls people to conversion to the truth, but at the same time unconditionally embraces everyone. Actually, that's pretty hard to do, and in practice, as a church, we tend not to be able to do it so well, because usually we're concerned to defend one pole, because we see one pole as threatened, right? So we say, we've got to defend the truth. What people need is clarity. They need to know where the church stands. The church needs clear rules and norms and morals so that people are absolutely clear about what they must do. But of course, that often is a very unmerciful way of conveying the church's teaching, and a limited way, because it doesn't tell you the whole truth about what God is trying to do with us. On the other hand, you have people who want to show the love and mercy of God and that everybody's welcome, and they do so often by downplaying the challenge of the truth of doctrine. So how do we hold those in better tension? Really gave rise to some of the best conversations in the assembly. Fiducia supplicans came out at the end of last year, and those of you who may not have heard about it, it means in supplicating trust. It's a Vatican document. It didn't come from the Synod, it came from the Vatican, on the blessing of people in same-sex relationships. Okay, blessing of the people in same-sex relationships, not the blessing of the relationships. What the document makes clear is that the church can only bless one kind of union, which is called marriage, and it's male-female, open to life, for life, and so on. However, everybody is blessable. There is nobody on this earth who, when they ask for God's help and God's grace, does not receive it. I don't know, some of you remember the film Rocky? Do you remember Rocky, Sylvester Stallone? After Fiducia came out, I read an article saying really what this is about is Rocky-style blessings. Now what I mean by that is, Rocky's off to his big fight, do you remember? And he stops by his parish priest. Do you remember that scene? He pulls up in his car and he goes, "Father, come on!" And this Italian priest puts up, "Hey, what do you want?" And he says, Rocky says, "Father, come on, I'm off to my big fight, and I got a baby on the way. And I don't want to get upbeat so bad because I need to look after my baby and my girl, Can you bless me?" And of course, what does the priest do? He goes, "Sì, certo, in nome del Padre, del Figlio, blah, blah, blah." And he goes off. It takes 15 seconds. Does the priest say, first of all, you're in an irregular relationship, you need to come and see me about that? Secondly, you're taking part in a boxing match, which is against the catechism, blah, blah. No, he responds to the need in that moment of that person to know, to be affirmed by God's love. That's what Fiducia supplicans is about. And Bishop Bergoglio said in his statement about Fiducia that it captures perfectly that polarity of truth and mercy. But here's something else I wanted to draw your attention to. One of the challenges of the new era for the church is that we live in a multipolar church. Okay, it's no longer a European church with missions. And I saw that very clearly at the assembly. We had bishops, the bishops from Europe, Latin America, and Africa were about the same number, 45, 46, 47, okay? Asia, Middle East, Oceania, a bit less. But you just looked at the room and you saw that we live in a multipolar church. That means we live in a world of very, very different cultures. And how do we manage the differences that are cultural, not doctrinal, cultural? Example, in the West now, for most people, it is a source of scandal that gay people might be excluded from the life and mission of the church and the love and the mercy of God. That is a scandal. Most of the young people that you talk to will tell you they don't like that about the church. They think gay people are excluded and so on. In Africa, the source of scandal is homosexuality itself. African bishops stood up at the assembly in Rome and they said, there is no homosexuality in Africa. And a few of us, smiled. But what they were really saying is, there is no public recognition. You can't be gay in Africa. If homosexuality is a source of shame, you deal with it in the family. So the African bishops, led by Cardinal Ambongo, when they saw Fiducia Supplicans, they were very upset, and they did a synodal discussion, and Ambongo went to Rome, and he said to the Pope, we can't do this in Africa. And the Pope said, sure, no problem. The African bishops weren't questioning the doctrine. They were saying, we can't do it culturally. We can't bless gay people. We can't bless people in gay relationships because gay relationships have no social or cultural recognition. Fine. That's how we navigate the polarities of our global church. Do you see what I mean? So that's truth and mercy and how we manage our differences. And I think this is one of the great gifts of the synodal way, is we learn to remain together in our differences. By the way, the question of same-sex blessings has divided all the Christian churches. The Church of England is completely split over it. So are the Baptists, so are the Methodists, and so on. They're all deeply split. And I think what Fiducia Supplicans does is it holds together brilliantly, these two things. And then the main thing really I wanted to respond to was, clearly some of you are very struck by this idea that we are in a transition from one era to another. What will the new era look like? I think some of you are asking. And Eddie, you were struck by the whole, this isn't decline but a transformation. There is a cultural shift going on. There's a lot to be said about this, and I don't have much time, but just to say this is about learning fundamentally to live in a church in which we know there will not be priestly vocations on anything like the level that there has been. And this is true of Europe, but it's also true of Africa and Asia and Latin America. Latin America has had few priests relative to population for decades. It's not a new problem for them. Do you know that in England and Wales, we've had the highest ratio of priests per people in the world, bar Malta? And yet people talk about a shortage of priests. Hang on, in the world. So partly we are dealing with the breakdown or the collapse of this model, which was very much fruit of the 1950s. Okay, we're not going back to that. In the synod, a German bishop stood up and he said, since he became bishop, he had ordained 15 men and buried 300 priests. Okay. And then the African bishop stands up and says, in my diocese, it's all growing and we have loads of baptisms and so on. But they have hardly any priests to manage huge areas. So this is a church which is, whatever else happens, we have to learn to recognize ministries and gifts and charisms that the Spirit is pouring out on lay people, on women, on, right? In other words, we have to look beyond the old model. Halleck tells the story of a woman who says to her rabbi, complains to her rabbi, that she's been praying for 20 years to win the lottery. She's been praying to God, and God hasn't answered her prayers. And the rabbi says, God has answered your prayers. The answer is no. and Halleck says, since he can remember, and I'm sure you relate to this, we've been praying for a springtime of vocations to the priesthood, haven't we? How many Good Shepherd Sundays, priesthood. And Halleck says, maybe it's time to stop knocking on the doors that God has closed and find the doors that God is opening for us. The Spirit is at work in the church, pouring out gifts of charisms. The question then is how we recognize them, how we organize ourselves to receive those charisms. And that is one of the big tasks. So that's one of the elements. And then the other point I just want a dimension of the change. Again, Halleck's very good on this. The biggest rise in the religious scene at the moment are the rise of the so-called nuns, N-O-N-E-S. They're the ones who tick none of the above when you ask what religion they are. You probably know quite a few people. Probably quite a few of them are your sons and your daughters, right? Because particularly young people say none. And they're not rejecting Christianity. They're often fascinated by Christ, but they don't like the institution. And the question I get most asked when I'm talking about synod is, how do we get the young people back into church? And I say, they don't want to be in church. If you care about young people, you've got to go out, listen to them, understand them, walk with them, and understand what it is that they're looking for and afraid of and so on. In other words, we have to have a deep synodal missionary listening to the people who we want to walk with. So how do we walk with the seekers? We have to become a church of seekers who can walk with the seekers. And that means having a very, very different culture. It's not about we have all the answers, come and we'll tell you what the truth is. It's more like we are all in humility opening ourselves up to the bigger truth here. Come and join us. Let's go on this journey together. And there's a lot more to say about this, but so the church as a school of communion, as a place, as a school where we can seek together, as a place of accompaniment. All these things require a transformation in the internal culture of the church, and that's really where I think the Spirit is pointing at the moment. But I'm not a soothsayer. I'm not trying to look into a crystal ball. So those are just some of the points. I think you said you were asking whether the book could be used after the spiritual exercises. I think probably it is most profitably used by people who know the exercises. But I like to think, and somebody said this in Dublin actually, that it would make also a very good book or a good method for the seekers, for people who actually are unsure about faith, because I think people are attracted by Francis and his whole approach. So I hope it could be used also in that way. But thank you, you're quite right.
Thank you, Austen. 10 minutes to 5. We just have a proposal to make, and it's around this Pilgrims of Hope, a year of Ignatian prayer, which I mentioned at the beginning. Now look, as Austen said, there are many ways to find God and to renew our church. This might be one of them. And what we're proposing, and what I'm going to ask Father Pierce to invite you to shortly, is this Pilgrims of Hope, an Ignatian year of prayer. And this is a request to those who are interested in joining this Ignatian year of prayer for the Jubilee, which begins when the Holy Door is opened by Pope Francis on Christmas Eve, I think, this year. So it's an invitation to join this journey as a seeker, but also as a helper. And there are those here and those in Belfast and in this country who have experience of finding God through the spiritual exercises, or in this way of finding God in Ignatian prayer, or want to find it. So I'll shortly pass the conch to Pierce. But just before that, we have a number of 2 other events coming up in May. First of all, a good friend of Austen's, Dom Christopher Jemison, will be here Sunday week to talk about a different language in addressing the issue of climate breakdown. The language that young people are hearing, and many people are hearing in the news, is deeply depressing, deeply pessimistic. There is a hopeful way of talking about this, which isn't optimistic, but it's hope-filled. And Dom Christopher is going to explore that on Sunday week at 3 o'clock here, followed by Mass celebrated in St. Patrick's by Dom Christopher at 6 o'clock. All welcome. The second event then is a Pentecost retreat, which we ran last year again, a quiet introduction to the work of the Spirit in our lives. When you say Pentecost, it sounds Pentecostal. What we found last year, yes, there was celebration, but it was also a journey into an experience of God's deep love for us at Pentecost and a discovery of our gifts. So those two issues coming up, or those two. And one final event coming up, which is two paintings hung in the house of the Mattei family in Rome, painted by Michelangelo de Caravaggio, a nearly convicted murderer and street brawler. One of them hangs in the National Gallery in London, and another hangs in the National Gallery in Dublin. And they're coming to the Ulster Museum in May. And because there's an extraordinary story behind the discovery of the taking of Christ above the mantelpiece in a Jesuit house in Dublin, we'd like to run an event marrying spirituality with artistic appreciation sometime probably in late May or June. And again, we haven't got it planned yet, but it'll be up on the website, just by way of coda. But before we close, and before we thank Austen for his energy, his dedication, his learning, and bringing Pope Francis to us and proposing something, I want to thank you, Austen, for that. And I'd like to invite Father Pierce just to come to make a proposal as we close. Thank you.
So it's just to say a little more about what has been mentioned, that having looked at what Austen has bottled here, our question is, in a sense, how to decant it. Austen proposes 8 days, 8 weeks. We wondered about 8 months as a way of taking what is here. For some people, it may be a review of the exercises that they already know. For others, it may be an introduction. But the important thing, we think, is that it would be an invitation to review Ignatian prayer in a guided and structured way, which is resourced through the comprehensive work that Austen has done here. So our idea is that over the course of a year, taking with the theme of the Going Forward in Hope, which is the theme of the Jubilee year, which will begin for 2025, that in the light of that year, that we will pursue the thread of the Pope's spirituality here in the book. And we would do that by inviting people who are interested to gather together once a month for a meeting in person, where we would present, here is the theme of this particular month, this is the chapter that we'll be thinking about in this month. And that would be able to give people an indication, a background, an impetus, an opportunity to reflect on the month that has gone by, to compare notes, and to be in companionship with others in the course of the reading. And then during the month, there might be supplementary meetings, such as being able to watch a film that picks up on a theme of that particular week or day that's being considered. And in watching the film, it's simply to say, well, what are the ideas here that tap into my prayer? So the linking of the genius of the whole idea is essentially to stimulate and to energize and to inform our own prayer as we go day by day in our personal prayer and personal reflection. And that personal reflection will be supplemented by, the comprehensive bibliography and references that Austen has offered to us here, and we'll be able to work our way through those. And there might be a meeting for prayer as well during the week or during the month, so that there would be intervals during any given month, maybe on 3 of the weeks, where people would gather either online, in person, or to pick up on what has been arising for them personally, or what's being presented to them for the following time. So that's really our idea. we're working it out. And I think partly it reflects for us that it is a decision, it's a response to what we are experiencing here. It's expressing something that we haven't done before, you haven't done before, and we can do it together. That's our confidence. So if you are interested in joining us on this pilgrimage, this adventure, we'd invite you to leave your name, or we'll be in touch with you through the mailing list that has brought you here. And we look forward to following through so that we can unpack and continue to savor what Austen has so valuably condensed for us and presented to us today.
Thanks to all for coming this afternoon, and thank you to all who organised it. The forms are online on our website, but they're also here in paper. If you'd like to take one with you or fill it out here, that's the option. So I think we've said everything. You fly back tomorrow. Will you come again?
Yeah. So just for me to thank Father Jerry and everybody here at the Belfast Jesuit Centre for this gift of the opportunity to present the book to you. Thank you for the reception of it, the warmth, the love, and so on. And just to say, if I can be of any help, if you do decide to go ahead with this, I'd be delighted, of course, to help in any way I could. So thank you for considering this. Thank you very much.